I felt his breath on my neck, and suddenly, I wasn't just his mother anymore. Olivia's whispered confession sent shockwaves through the room. In this video, we'll explore the taboo territory of unexpected attraction between a mother and son. Prepare for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about family bonds. I smoothed Matteo's hair from his feverish forehead, my heart aching for my boy. He looked so vulnerable, I can't even describe it. As a mother, I couldn't bear to see him suffer. I sat on the edge of his bed, wanting nothing more than to take away his pain. "Mom," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper, "can you stay with me for a bit?" How could I refuse? I nodded and settled in beside him. It felt so natural, so right, to comfort my son. I put my arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. His head rested against my chest, just like when he was little. His familiar weight, the scent of his hair, it all made me happy. But as I held him, after a while, I started to feel strangely different, uncomfortable. A wave of guilt washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. What was wrong with me? This was Matteo, my son, my baby. And yet, in that moment, I was acutely aware that he was a grown man. My heart was racing, and I hoped he couldn't hear its frantic rhythm. Matteo stirred, adjusting his position. His hand brushed against my bare waist. I was wearing a crop top, and lingered for a moment too long. Was it my imagination, or did his fingers curl slightly, as if wanting to hold on? Matteo's lips parted as if he was about to speak, and I waited for him to say something. No, this had to stop. Now, I hastily pulled back from the bed, almost falling off in my haste. I should get you more medicine, I mumbled. Matteo reached out, his fingers brushing my arm. Mom, wait. But I couldn't. With my cheeks burning with shame and something I didn't dare name, I hurried out of the room. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to erase the lingering warmth of Matteo's body against mine. This was wrong. So wrong. He was my son, for God's sake. I was supposed to protect him, nurture him. My head was so confused. But even as I tried to push those thoughts away, a small, traitorous part of me whispered that it had felt good. Even right, the curve of his body fitting perfectly against mine, the trust in his eyes as he looked at me. No, I couldn't go down this path. I wouldn't. Taking a deep breath, I straightened my shoulders and headed toward the bathroom. I would get Matteo his medicine, take care of him as any mother would, and forget that moment of madness ever happened. Part of me wanted to run away, to pretend this night never happened, to go back to being just a mother, taking care of her sick son. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, longed to return to Matteo's arms. The conflict tore me apart, leaving me feeling raw and vulnerable. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white. How could I feel this way about my own son? What kind of mother was I? Matteo was waiting for me, probably wondering where I'd gone. The thought of facing him again made me shudder a little with equal parts fear and anticipation. Taking a deep breath, trying to compose myself, I knew I had to go back there. I had to be the mother he needed. As I reached for the doorknob, my hand hesitated. What if this wasn't just a moment of confusion? What if there was no turning back? The thought both excited and terrified me. I closed my eyes and prepared myself for what lay ahead. Taking one last deep breath, I opened the door. The short walk back to Matteo's room felt like miles. I paused in front of his door, my heart pounding. Through the thin wood, I could hear Matteo's restless movements. Was he feeling the same conflict, the same mixture of shame and longing? I looked back at Matteo, his eyes meeting mine with a silent plea for me not to answer. The vulnerability in his gaze tugged at my heart and made me want to rush back to his side. But I couldn't ignore the insistent doorbell. What if it was important? A small, paranoid voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if someone knew?" Taking a deep breath, I straightened my clothes and tried to compose myself. I had to look normal, whatever that meant now. When I opened the door, I found our neighbor Daniel from across the street holding a casserole dish. "Olivia," he said, his voice warm with genuine concern, "I saw your lights were on and thought you might need this. It's my famous chicken soup. Always helps when someone's under the weather." I blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by this kindness. "Oh, Daniel, that's so thoughtful of you," I managed, trying to inject my voice with gratitude while suppressing the irrational resentment bubbling inside me. Why did he have to come at the worst possible time? "Please come in," I heard myself say, stepping aside to let him in. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. I didn't want anyone else in our space right now, intruding on the fragile, dangerous thing that had sprung up between Matteo and me. But it was too late to take it back without seeming rude. As Daniel chatted about the recipe and asked about Matteo's health, I felt a tingling sensation on the back of my neck. Without turning around, I knew Matteo's gaze was burning into me from the hallway. I was very uncomfortable with this situation and would ask him about it later. I ushered Daniel into the kitchen, desperate to keep him away from Matteo's room. While I was busy finding a place for the casserole in the fridge, Daniel leaned against the counter, his eyes never leaving my face. "Olivia, is everything all right?" he asked softly. "You seem, I don't know, on edge." I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as brittle as it felt. "Just worried about Matteo." I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "You know how it is with kids, even when they're grown." While we were talking, I noticed how Daniel's eyes softened when he looked at me, how he found excuses to touch my arm or stand closer than strictly necessary. Under normal circumstances, I might have been flattered by his attention. Now, it only added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. I took a deep breath, composing myself as I faced the two men in my kitchen. The air felt thick, charged with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite name. "Daniel, this is my son, Matteo," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Matteo, this is our neighbor Daniel. He brought over some soup for you." Matteo's jaw tightened as Daniel's hand brushed my arm in a friendly gesture. His eyes flashed with something dark and possessive, an expression I had never seen on my sweet boy's face before. I found myself torn between scolding him for his rudeness and secretly relishing the way his gaze burned with jealousy. Daniel, oblivious to the growing tension, chatted amiably about his latest home improvement project. "You know, I've been thinking about redoing my back patio," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "Olivia, I was hoping to get your opinion on some designs I found online." With my attention split between Daniel's words and Matteo's reactions, I nodded absently. Every muscle in Matteo's body seemed coiled tight, ready to spring. His responses to Daniel's attempts at small talk were curt, bordering on rudeness. "Sounds great," he muttered, his eyes never leaving my face. While Daniel rambled about stone pavers and outdoor lighting, I couldn't focus on a single word. I was hyper, aware of Matteo's every move, from the way his fingers drummed restlessly on the kitchen table to the slight twitch in his jaw. When had my son become this smoldering presence, radiating an intensity that both thrilled and terrified me? "Oh, I almost forgot," Daniel said, his voice cutting through my distracted thoughts. "I made way too much lasagna last night. I was thinking I could bring some over for dinner tomorrow, if you'd like." Matteo became increasingly angry. "That's very kind of you, Daniel," I stammered, desperately searching for an excuse to end this increasingly awkward encounter. "But Matteo's still not feeling well, and I think we'll need a quiet night in. Maybe some other time." Daniel's face fell slightly, but he quickly recovered with a warm smile. "Of course, no problem at all. You two take care of yourselves." He turned to Matteo, his tone friendly despite my son's icy demeanor. "I hope you feel better," he turned to Matteo, his tone friendly despite my son's icy demeanor. "I hope you feel better soon, young man." Matteo grunted in response, his eyes never leaving mine. Matteo, with a familiar gesture that tugged at my heart, ran a hand through his hair. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice strained. Unable to trust myself to speak, I simply nodded. We moved to the living room, the space between us charged with an electricity that both thrilled and terrified me. As we sat on opposite ends of the couch, I couldn't help but remember all the times we'd cuddled there, watching movies or sharing stories. Now that innocent closeness felt like a distant memory. "I don't know what came over me," Matteo began, his eyes fixed on his hands. "When you were comforting me, I felt something I've never felt before. My cheeks burned with shame and something else I didn't want to name. 'It's okay, sweetheart,' I said, falling back on the safety of my maternal role. 'You were sick, vulnerable. It's natural to seek comfort.' But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. What had passed between us was far from natural, far from innocent. I found myself remembering the warmth of his skin, the depth of his gaze. My heart raced at the memory, and I hated myself for it. Matteo looked up, his eyes searching mine. "But it wasn't just me, was it?" he asked softly. "I saw the way you looked at me, Mom." I felt it. I felt exposed, as if he could see right through me. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to find the right words. "Matteo, we can't." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken desires and forbidden longings. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed impossibly loud, each second an eternity. "What about Daniel?" Matteo asked suddenly, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite place. I blinked, thrown by the sudden change of subject. "What about him?" Matteo's jaw clenched. "He seems interested in you." I couldn't help but laugh, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "Daniel is just a neighbor, Matteo. Nothing more, but he could be." Matteo pressed. "He's closer to your age." It would be normal. The word normal hung in the air between us, a stark reminder of how far we'd strayed from what was acceptable. I felt a surge of guilt, knowing that I should encourage this line of thinking. Daniel was safe, appropriate, but the thought of being with him left me cold. "Matteo," I said softly, reaching out to touch his hand before thinking better of it. "What happened between us? It can't happen again. You know that, right?" He nodded, but I saw the flash of pain in his eyes. "I know," he whispered, "but Mom, I can't stop thinking about it." "About you?" His words sent a shiver down my spine, a mix of desire and fear that left me breathless. I knew I should shut this down, draw a clear line, but part of me, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, didn't want to. "We need some time," I finally said, my voice barely audible. "Some space to process this. To get back to normal." Matteo nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "And if we can't?" he asked, his voice low and filled with a longing that mirrored my own. I didn't have an answer for him. Instead, I stood up, needing to put some physical distance between us. "I think we both need some rest," I said, falling back on practicality. "You're still recovering, and it's been an eventful day." Matteo stood as well, and for a moment I thought he might reach for me, but he simply nodded, his hands clenched at his sides. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked away, I felt a piece of my heart go with him. I knew that no matter how much time or space we put between us, things would never be the same. The line had been blurred, and I wasn't sure if we could ever fully erase it. I thought putting distance between us would dull the ache. Instead, it only made me more aware of Matteo's absence, and when we were together, the smallest things, the brush of his hand, the scent of his cologne, sent shivers down my spine. Was I the only one feeling this way? Days stretched into weeks, and our attempts at normalcy felt like a fragile facade. We moved around each other in a careful dance, hyper, aware of every movement, every glance. I found myself memorizing the lines of his face when he wasn't looking, tracing the curve of his jaw with my eyes. The sound of his laughter from across the room would make my heart skip a beat. Our hugs, once long and comforting, became brief and tense. But oh, how those fleeting moments of contact lingered, the warmth of his body, the strength of his arms. It all felt different now, charged. dangerous. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, tossing and turning, haunted by memories of that evening. The way he looked at me, vulnerable and wanting. The heat of his skin under my fingertips. I'd squeeze my eyes shut, willing the images away, but they persisted, taunting me with what could never be. Family dinners became an exquisite form of torture. We'd sit across from each other, table between us like a flimsy barrier. Our eyes would meet over steaming plates, and suddenly the clatter of cutlery would fade away. In those moments, it was just us, lost in a world of unspoken desires. I knew we were playing with fire. Every shared glance, every accidental touch was another spark, threatening to ignite something we couldn't control. But I couldn't bring myself to extinguish the flame. The thrill of it, the forbidden nature of these feelings, it was intoxicating. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Matteo came into the kitchen. The space suddenly felt too small, too intimate. He reached past me to grab a glass, his arm brushing against mine. I froze, the knife I was holding clattering to the cutting board. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low and husky. I turned to face him and found myself trapped in his gaze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how close we were standing. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, count his eyelashes if I wanted to. Time seemed to stand still. I was acutely aware of the heat radiating from his body, the rise and fall of his chest. My eyes dropped to his lips, and I found myself wondering what they would feel like against mine. The thought sent a jolt of electricity through my body, equal parts shame and desire. Matteo's hand moved, almost as if he was going to reach for me. But then the moment shattered. The timer on the oven went off, its shrill beep cutting through the tension like a knife. We jumped apart, the spell broken. I should go set the table, Matteo said, his voice strained. He hurried out of the kitchen, leaving me leaning against the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. This couldn't go on. We were balancing on a knife's edge, and sooner or later, one of us was going to fall. But even as I thought this, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Each day, the line between maternal love and something else blurred a little more. I found myself making excuses to be near him, to touch him. A hand on his shoulder as I passed by, fingers brushing as I handed him a cup of coffee, small moments of contact that sent my pulse racing. I knew it was wrong. I knew we should stop, should put more distance between us, but the pull was too strong. Like a moth to a flame, I found myself drawn to Matteo, even as I knew it could destroy us both. As I gathered Matteo's laundry the next day, I noticed something interesting. Suddenly, a small piece of paper fell out of Matteo's jeans pocket. I bent down and picked it up. My breath hitched as I realized what it was. A photo, creased and worn at the edges, of Matteo and me at the beach years ago. My heart clenched as I stared at our smiling faces, frozen in a moment of pure joy. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the laundry forgotten. Memories flooded back, bittersweet and overwhelming. I remembered that day so clearly, the warm sand between our toes, the sound of Matteo's laughter as he chased the waves. He was just a boy then, all gangly limbs and infectious enthusiasm. I closed my eyes, letting the happier times wash over me. But even as I clung to those precious memories, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. There had always been something different in our relationship, hadn't there? A current I couldn't quite name. I thought of how Matteo had always sought my approval more than the others, how his hugs had lingered a little longer as he grew older. A wave of guilt and confusion churned in my stomach. Had I somehow encouraged this? The photo seemed to mock me, our carefree smiles a stark contrast to the turmoil I felt now. With a trembling finger, I traced the outline of Matteo's face, wondering where I had gone wrong. "Oh, Matteo," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "what have I done to you?" I thought of all the times I had put my own needs first, all the arguments we'd left unresolved, the school plays I'd missed because work had kept me late, the times I'd been too tired to truly listen when he needed to talk. Had those small failures accumulated over the years, warping our bond into something unrecognizable? My mind raced, recalling moments I'd dismissed at the time. Flash of hurt in Matteo's eyes when I'd started dating someone new. the way he'd hover protectively around me whenever my boyfriends came to visit. Had I been blind to the signs, too caught up in my own life to see what was happening? I suddenly stood up, pacing the small room. How had we gotten here, teetering on the edge of something so forbidden? I had always prided myself on being a good mother, on doing my best for Matteo. But now, faced with the weight of our unresolved issues, I felt like a failure. The photo felt like it was burning in my hand, a tangible reminder of everything that had led us to this point. Our past held more answers than I was ready to face, more questions than I dared to ask. What other moments had I missed? What other signs had I ignored? Unable to look at the photo any longer, I slipped it into my pocket. Its weight pressed against my heart, a constant reminder of the tangled web we had woven. I knew I needed to confront these issues, to have an honest conversation with Matteo about our past and our future, but the thought filled me with dread. As I continued to fold the laundry, my movements were mechanical and detached. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move and everything would crumble around us. The love between a mother and son was supposed to be simple, unconditional. How had ours become so complicated? As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluded me. My mind raced with thoughts of Matteo, of our conversation, and of the irreversible shift in our relationship. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something both exhilarating and terrifying, poised on the brink of something momentous. I found myself imagining the possible paths ahead of us, each one fraught with potential heartbreak and regret. Could we ever truly go back to the way things were, pretending this moment had never happened? Or would we be forever changed, our bond transformed into something unrecognizable? My heart ached as I realized that a certain innocence had already been lost, no matter what choice we made. The simple, uncomplicated love between a mother and son seemed to have vanished, leaving us adrift in uncharted territory. Yet, as I tossed and turned, a small part of me wondered if, perhaps, through this painful journey, we might gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and of each other. I would never recommend doing something like this. Life is painful, and we must live balanced lives. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more.